because it's really helping to set an agenda for how we're thinking about where the airline industry is going to be going over the next 20 years. And Alun was one of the principal authors of this report, and I'm delighted that you've managed to join us today. Thank you, Alun. Welcome.
Very pleased to be here, Chris.
So I've always been fascinated by the future, but almost in a way even more fascinated by the ways in which predictions of the future in the past have perhaps not quite come true. And so perhaps I could start with a slightly cheeky question and ask you, if you could go back to your sort of 10-year-old self and maybe ask yourself what's the most surprising thing about life today, what would that be?
Oh gosh, for my 10-year-old self, well, first of all, I guess I would have to break the news to him that in just over a generation, kids would be watching pretty much whatever they wanted all the time on their portable TV that they'd take to school, they'd take to bed with them. I mean, that would be pretty rough for him to hear. But actually more relevant to this discussion, I would probably tell him, and this would probably be even harder for him to hear, that Concorde wasn't going to last that long, and that actually we'd be flying less than half the speed when we go across to the States now. So just make the most. I tell him to make the most of Concorde while it lasted.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? In some ways, in many ways, industry's moved on leaps and bounds, but in certain quite sort of elemental ways, like speed, it's moved backwards in that sense.
Yeah, but for a 10-year-old, that's probably the most important thing there is, speed. Yeah. So top trump cards and all that.
Indeed. So, I mean, as you said, that's very relevant to our discussion because, we're here to look at how you think about the future, I suppose, is what we're really exploring here. It's the process by which the future is investigated and you plan for it, and that's really what SOIF, your organisation, SOIF Horizons, do. Perhaps tell us a little bit more about your work and what your organisation does.
Okay, well, I set up SOIF, School of International Futures, SOIF, SOIF, in 2012 with a colleague from the UK government who was leaving the government to do other things at the same time, Kat Tully, and School of International Futures was set up to promote the use of foresight, to promote methods that help you to understand the future and prepare for it to a wider audience. We'd both become interested in this while working in government. In fact, in 2005 I was part of the team that set up the Horizon Scanning Centre at the heart of the UK government, and the learning that we had there, we invested, if you like, into this new organisation, which has been working to do that ever since. Earlier this year, SOIF Horizons was spun out of original School of International Futures to focus on the consultancy side in particular.
Right, and so that, I guess, is perhaps why IATA came to you. What was that process like? We approached you for your expertise? Where did it go from there?
Yeah, well, we were introduced to IATA probably nearly 3 years ago now, I would say, on account of the work that we'd been doing, mainly government work at the time, and so there was some skepticism perhaps whether this knowledge that was picked up in a government context was directly applicable to an industry context, but actually I think for IATA this turned out to be probably quite valuable in the end, because of course IATA deals a lot with governments, has a lot of these conversations, and frankly the trends that affect governments affect industry as well. That's what you realize as soon as you start to work in this area, that there are a set of trends, many of which we're not that conscious of influencing our lives that much at any particular point in time, but when you look over a few years, over a decade or two, suddenly you realize these are the big forces that shape the way we live, the way our governments work, the way industry function, in an incredibly powerful way, and we ought to spend a little bit more time thinking about them. So that was how we had a few conversations from then, and I came here to IATA around about 2 years ago to sort of present the idea of how we could help IATA and IATA's members and we were engaged by IATA to do this initial project.
And that led to this report.
And that led directly to the report. The way that we work at SOIF and SOIF Horizons is that a report is a useful, I hope very useful thing to produce out of work like this, but we also worked and work in general with an organization's staff at several different levels in the production of the report. And I think the thing that I hope makes this report quite valuable for IATA and potentially for others is that there was quite a lot of interaction during its production, and a lot of people were at workshops through interviews, were asked to give their views to identify the trends that they saw coming, the implications. Once we got into doing analysing drivers of change and producing scenarios, they had to think what these scenarios would mean for them, their part of the business. So it's two things. First of all, it's a kind of report production, but it's a bit more than that because it runs through a number of engagements with an organisation to, of course, we get a lot from the organisation, not just information that they share, but also the potential to have the work have an impact. Because very often if you go off and you do your research, you produce a report, you give it back, you don't actually know what happens to the results, and you suspect quite often not very much.
Well, we're definitely going to come back to that because it certainly will be used. But I'm interested, were there any particular challenges about the aviation industry that made working with us or the results you were coming up with slightly different from maybe other business sectors you've worked with?
Yes, in a way. I mean, it turned out, I'm not sure we saw this at the start to the extent to which this was true, but it turned out to be almost a kind of great case study for the relevance and importance of doing this kind of work, in fact, because although it probably doesn't feel like that when you're in the aviation industry, it's actually, compared to a lot of sectors, hasn't actually changed that much over the past 20, 30, even 50 years. Go back to the Concorde story. So you can draw two conclusions from that, one of which I would say is wrong. The first conclusion, the wrong one, is, oh, well, you know, trends happen to other people, and we are immune because we're so big, because we work a lot with governments, because there's all this regulation, because aircrafts are very expensive. You can find a lot of reasons for saying, well, you know, we are not like the others. But actually, the more we got into this work, and I think we suspected it, including the IATA people who engaged us at the beginning, actually that was probably why they engaged us in the end, but this wasn't necessarily inevitably true for the long run. But there was a kind of, I think there was, I remember initially coming here to basically to pitch the project and to get people interested, and there was definitely a sense that, why are you telling all this to us? We're different. We're fine, thank you. And you can go and sort of go to your tech conferences and talk to people about this, but we're airlines. But you get into it, and actually, what you see is that there are some huge forces, some huge factors or drivers of change, as we call them, that are basically stacked up, queuing, if you like on the runway out there, to come and hit the airline industry. And there are some pretty significant changes in store and actually starting already to happen.
So, well, let's talk about that right now. I mean, it's very hard for you to summarise this report. I wouldn't ask you to do that in just this Facebook Live, but perhaps you could give us a flavour of some of the biggest challenges that you see coming down the track for the aviation industry over the next 20 years.
Yeah, well, I'll start with, we at the beginning of our work, we carried out a survey, we identified what we saw initially through desk research as kind of key important drivers of change, and then we did a survey within IATA and within a wider community to identify which were the ones that were going to be particularly significant for the airline industry. And from that initial stage of our process, we came up with a kind of list of the key drivers of change. And the two of these we used for the for the two axes that within which we constructed our scenarios later, and these two were identified as being highest impact and the sort of most uncertain, greatest uncertainty, if you like, or the least amount of predictability which way they would go. And we were kind of we're kind of curious how come these ones came out on top in the end, and not completely convinced they were the right ones. But as we got into the project, we discovered that they probably were. One of them, perhaps less surprising now, since we started the report, lots of stuff has happened there, is geopolitics and turbulence, a turbulent geopolitical context versus a calm one. Things weren't particularly calm in 2015, but they were a lot calmer than they are right now. So in a way, that one has started to sort of warm up a little bit already, perhaps sooner than we thought. But you might say geopolitics, airlines, there are more obvious things. But that one, when we played that out, I'll come on to that maybe in a minute, it turned out to be very important in all sorts of ways. And the other one is, and this was even more curious at first, is data. And again, there's been a lot more, we've heard a lot more about it. I would say actually very recently, there's a bit of a kind of spike in this around Facebook and Twitter and the tech companies and their power versus governments and their force for good or manipulability. So it is much more in the news, but again, airlines, data, it sounds like a kind of arcane sort of internal issue rather than a big one, but actually you put these two together, and the way we did that is by considering different sort of outcomes of each of these areas along two axes and then creating four scenarios out of that. They are a pretty powerful combination in terms of shaping an environment that airlines need to take account of and deal with. So by no means the only factors, but two particularly significant ones. And just to, you think about it in terms of ownership of airlines, first of all, both of them are quite interesting. In fact, geopolitical ones, to what extent do governments, in a difficult environment, in a conflictual environment between states, governments are more likely to want to have a handle on their aviation sector operators versus calmer. And then the data, we came to this question and actually have since publishing the report have explored it in more detail in other work. The very existence of the airlines as a business that is self-contained, that has assets on one side, that has technology, that has passengers, is really called into some question by the ability of the large technology companies, data owners and operators, to basically disintermediate or rather to intermediate, to insert themselves between the customer and the airline. So, if anybody can get in there, then they're moving towards owning the customer, and that is already happening to some extent. I'd say from what I've heard recently, it's well on the way.
That's definitely a topic that we've explored in the industry and in industry conferences, and I've heard that debate, and it's definitely top of mind. So I think that's very interesting, the two issues that you've just illuminated, the geopolitical and the data, and we'll certainly be discussing those over the coming months as we explore the report in more detail and some of the information we're going to put out. Okay, so that being said, perhaps you could then explain to us briefly about how the report can help different stakeholder groups. So, it was written with IATA, and obviously a principal target audience is airlines, but they're not the only audience for this information. Perhaps you could talk us through the different stakeholder groups you have in mind and how they might make use of this information.
Yeah, and this goes back to what I was saying before, which is that we look for a kind of mixed economy of people participating in producing the report already. For example, when we interviewed people, we didn't just speak to people in airlines. We spoke to to regulators, we spoke to aircraft manufacturers, etc. So we have already sort of built in some of the viewpoints and the concerns and questions raised by a number of groups in the sector into the report already, and hopefully these same people will be able to take some ideas out of it as well. And I think one of the benefits of taking this approach, I think in particular, ought to be a conversation to kind of enable support conversations between these different parts of the ecosystem, if you like. I mean, the obvious one is sort of between airlines and governments who are constantly talking to each other, and not always, in a nice, friendly way, sometimes sort of trying to push the one the other. But I think this should enable both sides of that conversation to kind of think about how, what is the good, positive relationship that they can have, such that airlines have a good context in which for them to operate, but also that governments get the most out of airlines, frankly, and they can also on the global level and these huge challenges that we face can be better addressed. What part airlines can play in that, and how
we talk a lot about how, firstly, the economic benefit that airlines help generate, but also the social benefits that sort of aviation helps to facilitate through better global connectivity and better actions. And I think that's absolutely the case that governments don't always recognise that, and we're sort of having to work with them to explain that. And I think some of the scenarios you point out in the report are very helpful in terms of describing the role that airlines can play in that context.
Yeah, it will be some of the other. We focused on the geopolitics and the data. Some of the other big drivers of change over the next 15, 20 years are, of course, the changes in demography and the changes in growth of middle classes in other parts of the world, and also even within regions, new markets opening up and things. So I think that there's a lot of conversations that need to be encouraged in around these sorts of questions and in different places.
So, we've talked a little bit about these audiences. What key piece of advice would you give to some of these groups when they're thinking about planning for the future? Is there a sort of key thing they've really got to bear in mind?
There's a key. I guess there's a key thing, as I sort of said before, not to do, which is think you can kind of outsource it to an organisation to do your thinking for you, and then bring it back and circulate it at the board meeting, and then everything will flow from there. First of all, you have to recognise it's hard. It's hard in any organisation to change, and airlines tend to be fairly large organisations with lots of different parts and pieces. So I guess the main point here is to try to bring realization in at as many levels as possible, and that's why I mentioned different parts of the organisation that there needs to be change. And it doesn't mean it has to be dramatic. Sometimes it may need to be, but that's generally when you've left it too late. If you can approach things ahead of time, you can start to sort of connect different parts of the organisation perhaps that don't work closely with each other. Kind of an obvious one is sort of technology, which is often in organisations being sort of put somewhere else, but actually bringing it in with sales, marketing, business development, and things like that. So the organisations do need to be different. But I guess some of these conversations are also about the partnerships in the future, and actually in work subsequent to the IATA work, this theme has come up quite a lot. Now, at the moment, you have different forms of alliances and things between airlines, and those work. In some ways, they work very well. In others, I've heard they don't always bring the commercial benefits that they're hoped for. But what are the partnerships of the future as well? I mean, are they? We talk about another thing that data and circulation of data enables is a lot closer connections between different industries, and with you and your wider network. And here I'm thinking, well, the travel agents, insofar as they have resisted their big disruption, various forms of travel agents, but also, for example, other transport providers, hotel chains, and in some of our scenario and post-scenario work, we were talking about kind of entertainment providers, sports.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing is and there was the McKinsey report on this recently, but the barriers between sectors are quite well, they're becoming more and more permeable and quite vulnerable, even in some kinds. So, in 20 years' time, in 15, 20 years' time, I think it would be very unlikely, I would say, that airlines will look as they do now. And of course, and by that I don't mean just another merger here and another alliance there. I think
you mean solely a provider of getting people from A to B.
I think the idea that you have this sort of distinct, fairly kind of closed off industry that owns or leases the assets and puts them into play is unlikely to be the way things work.
Fascinating. Okay, well, there's so much more we could talk about the report, and we don't have the time now, but we will be coming back to it. And Alan, I'm sure we'll hopefully speak to you again in the future. I just want to, as a final question, just ask you a bit more about the future relationship between SOIF Horizons and IATA. What are the next steps, do you think, and where do you think we'll be going from here?
Well, this is we're still developing these ideas, but there's already been a lot of interest from different regional parts of IATA and some airlines in hearing more about the report. And so I know that the IATA team has already been organising some events to kind of take the report out and talk about it, and that's, I think, already happened in France, and I think is due to happen in Brazil, and I think Sri Lanka, somebody mentioned, and other places too. So that's great, and the hope is that there will be sufficient interest in that for other, not just airlines, by the way, airlines or other parts of the wider sector to actually look at this report and think, well, this is very good. It's high level because it's for IATA, it's done for the whole industry. But what could you sort of come and explain that to us, come and tell us what this means for us, or could we do a slightly bespoke version of that that is more directly relevant to us and our particular environment? So that's something that we're talking about doing as a partnership as well with IATA, potentially. So yes, there are lots of plans developing here, and what we really hope, as we say in the end of the report, is that, and as you said, or rather you ensured us wouldn't happen this time, is that we don't want the report to just sort of sit on the shelf or in your as a PDF in a folder somewhere on your machine. There are lots of different parts of it that you can reuse. You don't have to take the whole thing. Reuse, redo it yourselves, do some thinking, and then potentially if IATA can help you with that, then come and call IATA.
Absolutely. I mean, the report contains a number of recommendations that are by no means just things for 20 years' time. They're actions on which the industry can think and plan and practically work on now. So that's hugely important, and so we can use and will be using this report. But I hope that, in part of your work with us in going to these various stakeholders, that for the sake of your 10-year-old self, I hope you can remind people that we want to see some faster supersonic planes zooming around the world, connecting the world even faster and more exciting for the future. Alan, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure hearing your thoughts, and I hope we can speak again in the future. All the very best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Pleasure to be here.